Alan and Sean here from the Prancing Pony Podcast, welcoming you to the Tolkien Experience Podcast.
The Tolkien Experience Podcast is an attempt to bring the fan and scholarly communities together around our shared passion, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Each episode features a notable scholar or member of the fan community sharing their Tolkien experience.
And now we'll send you over to Sarah and Luke.
Thanks, Alan. I'm Sarah Brown.
And I'm Luke Shelton.
Every other week, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guest to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any more delay, let me introduce our guest. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Tolkien Experience Podcast. Today I'm really excited to have with us Dr. Andrew Higgins. And I have known Andy Higgins since about 2010 when we met at a conference called Festival in the Shire, which was in Wales in a little village called Pentryd Vendigaid. And it is where he and I first bonded over, well, frankly, we were fangirling over Ferlin Flieger and Tom Shippey being at this conference. And it's where both of us first met Dimitra Fimi in person. And I'm sure Andy will tell us a little bit more about the impact that these meetings had on him and all of the research that he did on Tolkien. But welcome to Andy. Hi.
Hello, Sarah. How are you? Yes, I remember with fond memories that morning when we were sitting there having breakfast in the little pub at that festival, and Tom Shippey and Ferlin Flieger both walked in at the same time, and we were just like, oh my God, it's Tom Shippey and Ferlin Flieger.
I know, it was like welcoming rock stars, wasn't it?
Exactly. We were their groupies.
Yes, we were very respectful groupies, though.
That was an interesting one because we had Corey Olsen come over, and that's when I remember Corey first talking about the Mythgard Institute. And Dimitra, it was like when we all came together in this amazing fellowship. Yeah, it was fantastic.
Yes, indeed. And since then, of course, you have passed your PhD, and your thesis was The Genesis of Tolkien's Mythology, which was about Tolkien's earliest attempts at world building and focused on mythology and his earliest language invention. And hopefully you'll tell us a little bit more about that later.
Sure.
Okay, excellent. So let's get started with the first question, which is, how were you introduced to Tolkien's work?
Well, my dad was a massive Tolkien fan. He was a member of the Tolkien Society of America, and he actually met Dick Plotz, who was probably best known as the Plotz declensions guy, the one that Tolkien gave that declension to. And I remember from my earliest days having in the house some of the Tolkien journals, Orcris, Minutes to Evening Star. And when I was 6, he read my brother and I The Hobbit. And then when I was about 7, we started The Lord of the Rings, and we would read a chapter a night after dinner. And he was an amazing Gandalf. He was a great Gandalf. And I just remember every night after dinner looking forward to the next chapter. So really it was my dad. And one Christmas he bought me that big red, the red Book of Westermarsh version of The Lord of the Rings. So my dad started me off very much on that. And then I just became very, very interested. And from the earliest time, I think the languages were of a special interest to me. I remember when the first time when he was reading when Gildor and Glorian meets the hobbits on the way to Rivendell, and that first bit of Elvish, and it just blew my mind. And I said, well, what does all that mean and everything? And I remember reading the appendices over and over again, the appendices on the languages and everything. So interestingly, that's where my love of Tolkien's languages started as well. So if it weren't for my dad, I don't know if I would have ever been introduced to Tolkien, and I'm really grateful to him for that.
Oh, that's a lovely story. So the languages then, would you say that's your favorite part of Tolkien's work?
Yes, absolutely. And I've always wanted to learn more about them. I remember my dad had the Road Goes Ever On songbook, the one with the songs in it that he did with Donald Swan. And I remember in there, Tolkien gave some additional information on Namadie and Elbereth Cathaniel. And I remember just devouring that and making notes about it. And then later on, I actually, although I wouldn't buy it today, I did buy it then, the Ruth Knoll book on Tolkien's languages, which was kind of a compendium of the languages and tried to create a one language, which is definitely not something to do. But at the time, I read it like crazy. And I remember trying to translate, I think it was Shadow of the Past into Sindarin. And thank God that manuscript has long gone away somewhere. But yeah, there was something. And for me, it wasn't just, there were two aspects to that. One was the beauty of the language itself and how it worked with the mythology. So those two things interested me, but I was also interested in the fact of just looking at the language sui generis outside of the mythology, just to see how he structured it, the syntax, the verbs, etc. And I also tried inventing some of my own languages, which were probably very elvish when I did them. So yeah, that was a very early interest of mine, which of course persists to this day.
Yeah, because you've actually given quite a few conference papers around Tolkien's languages, haven't you?
Yeah, well, what really interests me about Tolkien scholarship is, we, thanks to the incredible work of the editors of Tolkien's papers, which are language papers, which still continue, we have been given these incredible documents of the different conceptual stages of Tolkien's languages and how they work with the mythology. And what I'm always interested in doing in some of these conference papers and everything is taking one very small aspect of that and really looking at it and investigating it. So like Tolkien wrote a couple of lines of Quenya called Sequenta Feanor, which is just a little passage that he wrote kind of during the Book of Lost Tales period. And it's fascinating to see not only how the language worked back then, but also how it's incorporated into the mythology. Because, as Verlin Flieger's favorite bumper sticker says, for Tolkien, mythology is language and language is mythology. The two go together. So yeah, that fascinates me. And I think there's a lot of work still to be done on those different language papers and everything. And there's more to come as well. We're only into the 1940s in terms of the publishing of all this material.
This seems like a really good place to sort of bring in the thesis that you did for your PhD then, because you were telling me that this focuses on mythology and Tolkien's earliest language invention. So what sort of things were you talking about in your thesis?
Well, what I looked at is, this idea of world building, that, these worlds are created by using different elements of culture, of mythology, of language, of visual elements like maps and charts and everything. And all these kind of go together to create what, Mark Wolf calls the gestalt of secondary world building. So these worlds seem real because they have culture, they have language, they have visual elements, etc. And for me, the Book of Lost Tales period is the first time that Tolkien really tries his hand at this type of world building. So in my thesis, I looked at how these different elements work in terms of bringing together a world for the first time. He did a bit of it, as Verlin Flieger has pointed out, in his development of the Kullervo story from the Finnish Kalevala. But it really was in the Book of Lost Tales that he starts to really develop a real secondary world. And so that's what my thesis looked at, and especially for me, because the editors of Tolkien's papers have published the original Quenya lexicon and the original Goldegrin, which were the really two first languages, Elvish languages that Tolkien invented. We have that information. So it was really digging into all those documents. And then along the way, of course, while I was doing that research, again, working with Dr. Dimitra Fimi, who was my amazing PhD supervisor, my guiding light of Tolkien everything. We were at the Bodleian Library because I got permission to look at some of the papers there. And while we were going through one of the manuscripts for A Secret Vice, we uncovered a language that no one had ever seen before, which was this language called Funwegian, which later became the work that both Dimitra and I did in co-editing this book called Secret Vice, Tolkien on Language Invention. So again, all through my scholarship of Tolkien, there's this very strong dominant thread of looking at the languages and how both they work in themselves and also how they are part of this world building and this myth making of Tolkien's. Because for Tolkien, all his life. I mean, when we look at Tolkien's work academically, he was always focusing on lit and lang, which of course is philology. And that's the kind of curriculum him and Lewis were trying to create. So that's kind of that's the tools I use for my scholarship of Tolkien's work.
Oh, that's fascinating, Adi. And I'm really glad that you mentioned A Secret Vice, which for me is one of the most important books that has come out in recent years on Tolkien's languages. And it's one that I have referred to on a number of occasions. It must have been amazing to get to work together with Dimitra Fimi on work like that.
It is the highlight. It is probably the highlight of my life, basically, because I had such respect and admiration for Dr. Fimi as my PhD supervisor. And she's just such a wonderful person and so caring and so giving, and has developed this whole new crop of Tolkien scholars. So to actually get to work with her on a project like this, and I remember when we were at the Bodleian and we were going through this Secret Vice materials, MS-24, Tolkien MS-24, and we started talking about, wow, could this become a book? And she had already been doing some work on this little essay that Tolkien had written on phonetic symbolism. She'd been working on decoding it because, as we all know out there, Tolkien's handwriting is not the easiest handwriting in the world to decipher.
Not wrong there.
No. And so when we just, and to come in on a project like that with her was incredible. And the journey we went on in terms of, different, and I know Dr. Fimi's already talking on the episode about, discovering the James Joyce and the Gertrude Stein. For me, it was coming across these 2 pages that had not been published by Christopher Tolkien in the original Secret Vice from 1983 when he published the essay of Monsters and the Critics. And it was of this language called Funwegian. And what was even more incredible is when we discovered, we literally spent 2 years trying to figure out when he gave this talk. We had no idea when he gave it. No one knew. We'd gone through so many different journals and club things and all that stuff. And finally, right towards the end, we found that Tolkien had actually given this talk to the Samuel Johnson Society in Pembroke College, November 1931. And in the minutes, it mentioned, the only language it mentioned Tolkien talking about was Funwegian. And I remember just Dimitra and I looking at each other going, oh my God, this is unbelievable. So this was true, the true scholarship in a way, because we uncovered all this stuff and it was fantastic. So yeah, for me, it's the highlight of my life, and working with Dimitra was just amazing.
Well, I can understand that, because I think there's a number of us in Tolkien academia that owe a lot to Dimitra Fimi, and I include myself in that, because if it wasn't for her, I would probably not have started a PhD myself, because she pushed me into it. So I think we both actually have a lot to thank Dimitra for.
Absolutely. She's amazing. And I remember, I was sitting there going, but wait a minute, I've got a full-time job. How am I going to do this? And I used to go to, and I remember I started my thesis by doing these. I took every chapter of the Book of Lost Tales and did like a very detailed analysis of it. And then I would sit down with her and she would go through it. And she never the great thing about Dimitra, she never tells you anything. She just points things out to you and lets you find the way, which is a true teacher, So she's amazing. I'm very lucky.
Yeah, I agree completely. And just to come back to your thesis for a moment, I understand that there is a distinct possibility of a book coming out of this thesis.
Yes, there will be a book. I have pledged to that. It's become a bit. I'm starting to feel the way Tolkien must have felt when he was commissioned to do that Chaucer edition that John Bowers has just done this book on called Tolkien's Lost Chaucer, and he tried and eventually he had to give all the papers back. Well, that's not going to happen to me, but unfortunately, sometimes life gets in the way of Tolkien research. And I've had a couple of interesting years, and it's there. There are chapters written. I just need to kind of bring it all together in 2020, and that is my pledge. I'm about to start a new exciting job, and that's going to take up a lot of my time, but I am pledging to get it done. And what I've really done is kind of taken the thesis and really looked at everything from this world building aspect, basically. So the Mark J.P. Wolf's book on world building has really been helpful there as a text to kind of look at this as world building and everything. So yes, it will not become my Silmarillion, I promise. I will get it done. But I do feel the way, because it's funny when you read like Hammond and Skull, and they talk about when Tolkien did a lot of his work, it was like on holidays and on long vacations. And I can really identify with that now, basically. Yeah, it will get done, I promise.
Good. Well, I, for one, will very much look forward to that day because I know that book will definitely be making an appearance on my shelf.
Oh, well, thank you. As will yours.
Okay, that is currently my Silmarillion. One day, one day, one day. Okay, so we've talked about some of your really good experiences working with Tolkien's texts. Can you pinpoint one fondest experience of Tolkien's work?
Well, I mean, I've got it. Going back to working with his actual manuscripts is incredible, because you never become as close to an author as you can when you actually sit there and see his writing, basically. And I remember when I was doing my thesis, there was I ordered up a bunch of the boxes, and I was going through some of them, looking at stuff around Anglo-Saxon or something like that. And I came across this page, and it just said Gandalf and magic. And
I remember that page myself.
Yes, remember. And, all of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Hobbit pages, of course, are at Marquette. But for some reason, this page had been, I think it was on the back of a calendar or something. And it just talked about Tolkien. And I remember the really interesting thing was Tolkien never wrote Black Riders. He just wrote BRs.
BRs. Gandalf afraid of the BRs.
The BRs, yeah, exactly. And I just thought, wow, this is incredible. And that's like one of those moments I'll never forget, basically. So yeah, that was, one of these days I will get to Marquette, but I mean, just seeing that was incredible. So yeah, working with and seeing his manuscripts. And I basically decided to read everything. I mean, I just spent weekends at the Bodleian just reading everything and trying to transcribe things. And then I would work on, transcribe something in the morning in his very difficult handwriting. Like there's a red book of his original essays that he wrote when he was a student at Exeter. And I love the fact that it's a red book, which I remember just reading through. And these were like Tolkien's, undergraduate essays on Chaucer and stuff like that. I mean, it's fantastic stuff. But I would spend mornings transcribing all of his stuff, and then in the afternoon I'd open another box, and there would be a typescript version of it or something, and I'd be like, ah. But yeah, that was an amazing privilege to see those papers and everything.
So, would you say that the way you've approached Tolkien's work has changed over time?
Yeah, well, I think what Tolkien has taught me is to really look at the language from this kind of lit and lang perspective. I mean, when these different journals like Parma Eldalambaran and Vinya Tangwar are published, what might look like a dry list of names actually has within it all kinds of stories that Tolkien was telling through his language invention. So just like you could read the narrative, I try to read Tolkien's language documents from that same kind of perspective. And of course, this all comes into philology, which of course was Tolkien's main love. So I try to apply that type of thing. And that's something Tolkien taught me, really. And I think there's a lot more work that can be done with those language documents. If you look at, for example, one of the earliest Quenya dictionaries, there are names of fairies in there that don't ever appear in the Book of Lost Tales, but they're there in the Quenya dictionary. So was Tolkien planning to do something with that? So there's all kinds of little mathoms and treasures one could find by, being a word nerd and looking at all the language stuff. And that's what I tried to do. So I think, again, going back to that mythology is language, language is mythology, there's a lot to stuff to mine in Tolkien's language works. And the great thing about the language papers, too, is we see Tolkien at different stages of his development and different stages of the conceptual stages of the mythology. languages change and shift, because Tolkien was doing this was for Tolkien. So if he wanted to change the way, the past tense of a verb was done, he would just do that and everything. So it's not about trying to find one common language, which some people have tried to do. It's more looking at each of those conceptual phrases. And this is what people like, one of my great language gurus is Karl Hochstetter, who's one of the editors of Tolkien's language papers, and Jim Allen's book, which I think is still one of the best books on Tolkien's languages, to try to look at each of these conceptual stages as you would from a philologist point of view, and basically. So yeah, I think that's that's certainly what I learned in my Tolkien scholarship, and I try to apply to it now.
Well, I can tell from your voice, Andy, that you still have a great passion for this interest in Tolkien's languages.
I do. I just wish there were more time.
Yeah, you'll have to retire and then just devote yourself to writing books on it.
Exactly. I wish there was like one day a week where all you could do is Tolkien stuff, just. But I try to do as much as I can. And what's fantastic too is that there are other people out there, people like Nelson Goering and things like that, who are also looking at Tolkien's language from a very philological perspective and everything, which is brilliant. Because I think the more work that we can do on this, the more scholarship we can get out there, the better. And I think Tolkien would have appreciated that as well, because I think that's how Tolkien thought, basically.
So talking of mathoms and treasures, as you were just a few moments ago, what about Tolkien's scholarship at the moment is exciting you? What do you see happening within Tolkien scholarship that is particularly interesting?
Well, I just think there's this amazing group of, Tolkien scholars who are, a lot of us, come from taking courses in Mythgard Institute and Signum University and things like that. And I go to Kalamazoo, where there are Tolkien sessions, and we're now going into our 5th year of the Leeds Tolkien conferences, which are brilliant. And I think people are looking at Tolkien from lots of different perspectives. Have someone like Christine Larson, who does amazing work on Tolkien and astronomy, which is fantastic, and Chris Vaccaro looking at queer theory. I mean, all these different perspectives. I mean, Tolkien very much, when you look back at Tolkien scholarship, a lot of it was based on, medieval stuff. And now that's just expanding, eco-critical. I think there's so much great work being done in Tolkien studies. And when you look at something like the Journal of Tolkien Research, which is, has all kinds of great articles on it and everything, that free access and everything, great way for people to publish their scholarship. I think it's going to keep going. And, we just had the 50th anniversary of the Tolkien Society in Birmingham, and the papers that were given there were fantastic. So I see this continuing to increase. And I'm just reading this volume called Something's Cracked by Walking Tree Press on Tolkien and World War I. And there's just some amazing papers in there that have given me all kinds of ideas of where to go in some new scholarship. So I think it's a very vibrant community, and I think we're all learning from each other, and we're all in communication, and it's a great new generation of Tolkien scholarship, as well as older scholars who are still very, very much connected to, like, some of my Tolkien scholar gurus like Tom Shippey and Verlin Flieger and Michael Drought and people like that, kind of Jane Chance, people who that we're building on, basically. So I love being part of this community because it is so vibrant, and there's so much more to explore from so many different areas.
Yeah, it's an exciting time actually to be a Tolkien scholar, but you don't even need to be a full-blown Tolkien scholar embarking on a PhD sort of thing, because it's a very welcoming community, isn't it? And it's lovely that people want to engage with it, even if they don't want to do something formal like a qualification in it. Tolkien scholarship is really welcoming to others, and it's always nice to engage with new people, don't you think?
Yeah, it is the most welcoming community I've ever been a part of. And, we have things like Oxenmoot, and we have the lead seminars where people can just submit a paper proposal if they have got an interesting idea that they want to explore or something like that. And you've got a group of people that are going to sit there and listen to it and give you comments and helpful advice and all that. it is the most supportive thing. And, I remember the first time I remember the first time talking to Tom Shippey, and, he is quite an imposing figure. And I remember him just giving me some wonderful advice about something that I went and I did. And later on, through Signum, got to take several courses with him. And people like Berlin Flieger are so supportive in everything. So yeah, anyone who wants to get involved with Tolkien Studies. And then you have things like, right now, look at it. We've got the Prancing Pony podcast. We've got Corey Olsen doing Exploring the Lord of the Rings, several other podcasts. The amount of Tolkien exploration out there is incredible. So I think this is an amazing time to study Tolkien, and any aspect that you want to. It's a very, very engaging, broad community.
So this almost seems like a superfluous question, really, but would you ever recommend Tolkien's work? Why or why not? And not just in terms of academia, but to somebody who just wants to read.
Absolutely. Of course I would. And a lot of people, I know a lot of people say to me, oh, I tried, I read The Hobbit and I got halfway through Lord of the Rings and things like that. And I always say, look, in a way, give it another try and think of it as an adventure. And, for the Silmarillion, the best thing that you could do is read the Silmarillion and listen to Corey Olsen's course on it, because he literally went through it. And it's one of the best things I ever heard about the Silmarillion. So I would recommend, and I would especially recommend, also looking at Tolkien's language work as well, because, that's an area that might not be as familiar, but there's all kinds of stuff in there. And I also, the other thing I've fallen in love with recently is all of Tolkien's academic works, things like Finn and Hengist, which has amazing things, and his notes on the Exodus, the Old English Exodus. There's a lot to explore out there, definitely. And I just reread Tolkien's Letters from Father's Christmas over Christmas, and it just blew my mind about the way, again, these letters became elements of world building, and he builds a world, and there are goblins and there are elves and polar bears and language. There's the Arctic language, so that's its own world building. So it's a very, very, very rich tapestry to draw upon, and I envy the person who's never read The Lord of the Rings, because I think to read it again for the first time must be to read it for the first time must be incredible. Every time I reread it, and I read it once every couple of years. It always comes with the kind of the baggage of academia, and you're looking at things and you're studying things, but just the wonder of entering Middle Earth for the first time must be amazing. So highly recommend it. Yep.
Yeah, I have to agree with you for obvious reasons. I have to agree with you there. Tolkien's work has been around now for quite some time. So just as a final question to you, Andy, why do you think Tolkien's work has remained popular for such a long time? Why does it still speak to us?
Well, I think part of the reason is because Tolkien has, created this world that, as he said, you can enter in, and there's a depth to it. There's a history. It lives, it breathes. You can go into this world. I think that's one thing, but I also think it's Tolkien's writing. He's got the most amazing narrative style, and all different types. And I think for me, rereading The Lord of the Rings recently, what really struck me was all the different types of narrative styles he uses. And, you go from the Shire, all the way to this, highfalutin kind of language of Minas Tirith and things like that. But all these different races. And I also think, in today's world, this idea of, all these different peoples coming together to fight a common enemy, working together as a fellowship, I think speaks volumes for the world today. And I think, we need Tolkien in this world, basically. And I think that's an important part of why. Why are all these medieval kind of epics so popular now? I think we are looking for that time when people came together as a community to fight a common evil, and that's what Tolkien does. That fellowship, I think, is so important. So yeah, I think that's why that's why Tolkien, I love the fact every time I go into a bookshop and you see, the science fiction and fantasy section, and it's, rows and rows and rows and rows of books. And you think back when Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, and it was published in the 50s, there weren't that many of those books. That Tolkien, created this whole genre now, basically. I mean, there was fantasy before Tolkien, of course, with Dunsany and Morris and people like that, but he's created this incredible legacy, basically. So yeah, I think that's why they persist. And my feeling about the Peter Jackson movies and things like that is that they're great, and if they get people interested in Tolkien and get them to read the books, even better.
I think that's a really important message there, Andy, isn't it? That Tolkien speaks to us because it brings us together, and it's something that brings us joy in a world that can otherwise be a little bit difficult. So It's wonderful to have something like Tolkien that brings so many people together.
Yeah, and that idea of hope, that theme of hope, and that line from the Battle of Maldon, when everything is around us and is being destroyed, the heart should be harder. I'm paraphrasing. I won't do the Anglo-Saxon, but just that idea of what Tolkien talks about is hope against despair, and that eucatastrophe, that sudden joyous turn that happens, basically. We need that in this world, basically.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think that's a wonderful note on which to close this particular podcast.
Excellent.
Andy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. And I so love this podcast, and I'm looking forward to hearing more and more episodes.
And we're looking forward to doing more of them.
I know. Great.
Dr. Andrew Higgins, you have been a spectacular guest. Thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you, and Namarie.
Namarie.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We have a lot of fun making these podcasts.
So much fun. It's always exciting to talk to fans and scholars about their Tolkien experience.
If you want to know more about the ways to connect with this episode's guest that they mentioned in this interview, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. Also, don't forget to follow the podcast on your favorite social media sites.
That's right. We're on Facebook as Tolkien Experience, and also on Twitter as @TolkienEXP. So don't forget to like, follow, share, and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking with our guests. You can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I am @LukeB.Shelton.
You can also look for me on Twitter, where I am @AaronLPalmadill. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.